Hey guys, Phil Baumhart here. So for today's video, I'm going to be covering some Viking Age swords I saw in Paris at the Army Museum. So in March 2024, my wife and I took a vacation to France, mostly in Paris, sort of a late honeymoon of sorts. But I got the opportunity to visit a bunch of museums and see a lot of cool swords and other weaponry. By far the most impressive collection was at the Army Museum, which is a military museum in Paris that has got weapons and armor from as far back as the early Iron Age all the way up into the 20th centuries. The total amount of artifacts was absolutely staggering. I didn't even have time to see everything, let alone take photos or video everything. And while visiting these types of places, I like to do my best to gather as much information as I can and taking photos and video. The purpose of this video is going to be sharing my findings with you guys in case you find it helpful in your own quest for knowledge. But as a tourist, it's of course impossible to try to catalog everything. The kind of dim lighting and glare off the cases really brings down a lot of the image quality. I'm trying to work around other tourists and other visitors, so all my footage might not be the best. I tried to explore the three-dimensionality and details not really found in generic internet photos. So to me, that's why it's so important to try to record as much as I can of these artifacts that I'm seeing that most interest me. So for today's video, we'll be focusing on the Viking Age swords at the Army Museum. And since this is in France, I think calling them Carolingian swords might be a little more accurate than calling them Viking swords. But as I'm sure a lot of you know, the Franks were famous for making good swords. They of course had the crucible steel and the Ulfberts. But even from the beginning of the Viking Age, they were able to make very high quality swords. But I think the swords in this particular display give us a decent chronology of sort of the later Viking Age into the late Middle Ages. While the description plaques in the museum lacked a great deal of information other than a vague placement geographically like Western Europe and a rough period of about 100 years of what century the sword belonged to, I've attempted to compile as much information as I could about each piece. Thankfully, 5 of these swords were covered in Swords of the Viking Age by Ian Pierce, so I was able to lean heavily on that book for more information about many of these swords. Alright, so the first sword we're going to look at is catalog number JPO 2245, which is actually just a hilt, but it's still a fascinating piece nonetheless. The museum dates this to the 9th century, so this would be the 800s AD. And from what I can ascertain, I believe this to be a Mannheim type hilt. In the early Viking Age was popular among the Franks as well as the Danes. You can see there's some Latin letters on the upper guard there. So I think it's definitely safe to say that this is a Frankish sword since they were Christian by that period. So it looks to me like this has got some brass overlay. Now brass, bronze, and copper were all commonly used as decorative materials. We can see where some of this decoration is missing. It's got the iron underneath. So grooves were cut into the iron and the softer metal was hammered in, making those ornamental striations. And it has this small, looks like a braided ring of that same sort of brass. And I wonder if this served as like a decoration on the grip, like if it was the center of the grip, you know, the rest of the shape of the handle tapered away from it. For making my own swords, I've used braided brass rings like that to kind of fill in the gap between the handle and the pommel, or the handle and the guard. It just sort of helps fill in that gap and cinch everything up nice and tight. So I wonder if it was just sort of used as a shim in the construction of the sword. And so while this Mannheim type hilt I think can certainly be classified as a Frankish design, it was popular among the Danes. And then you got these 3 low lobes, and later in the Viking Age the Scandinavian hilts kind of evolved from this lobed idea. They make these very bulbous larger lobes, but to me this is kind of indicative of the initial design inspiration for other sword typologies that we see later in the Viking Age. Also interesting to note on this hilt is the wear on the very top and on that protruding side of the pommel, which from reading some of the work of Sue Brunning, I believe indicates that this is from someone wearing the sword, resting their hand on the hilt there, and just gradually wearing down that gilding, because you can see further in the center of that upper guard, the letters are much more defined. It looks like it's been rubbed down over time versus just straight up disintegration or corrosion. So that's something that I think is kind of cool. So our next sword is going to be JPO 2250. This one's going to be around the same period, if not a little later. It's a broader time range, so mid-8th to mid-10th century, 750 to 950, somewhere in that period. Which isn't saying much, because that's pretty much the bulk of the Viking era, but I digress. So I think this one is a Type C hilt, based on the kind of center rib of the upper and lower guard and those chamferings. The Type B just has got a typically much shorter guard and pommel. It's a little bit more squat, so that's why I think this is a Type C. The Type H is a kind of a later version of a Type C. The big difference being that the pommel was actually a separate piece and was pinned on to that upper guard. So the Type B and C, the tang would have gone all the way through to the end of the pommel before being peened over. Since this one, you can see that whole pommel is kind of cocked off to the side. If this was a Type H, I think that we would see the pommel kind of disattached from that upper guard as well, but I'm not sure. I could be wrong. The Type B, C, and H were all known to be sort of Frankish hilt designs that were imported into Scandinavia. So the Type Cs are quite a few are also found in Norway and Sweden, whereas the Danes prefer the Type B and the Mannheim type hilt, based on the archaeological evidence of grave finds. Here we have JP02253. This is going to be the first sword featured in Ian Pierce's Swords of the Viking Age. So he has it classified as a Peterson Type X. He gives the time period as the 10th century, and he has it measuring about 37 inches overall with a 31-inch long blade. So with it being a Type X, it's going to have a solid pommel with that designation between the upper guard and the pommel just being a saw cut to give the appearance of two pieces of iron. This is definitely a later type sword with what Ewart Oakeshott described as a tea-cozy type pommel. Pierce describes the sword as being pattern welded in its construction with a blood eddy style of pattern welding. And this is where they take 2 or 3 bars of wrought iron and phosphoric iron, twist them, and then forge weld those 3 bars together to get the width of the blade. And then when you grind in the fullers, you get all these really interesting swirling patterns. And because of the corrosion and the well-conserved nature of this sword, we can kind of make out some of those patterns. So it kind of looks like it has 2 narrow fullers instead of 1 broad one, but I'm not sure if that's a trick of the light or just the way that the corrosion has eaten away at it. But still pretty fascinating. It looks like these vertical striations indicate where the steel for the cutting edge of the sword were forged welded on either side of the pattern welded blood eddy. This manner of blade construction is quite old, dating back to the 5th and 6th centuries in Scandinavia, England, as well as the continent. This sword probably represents one of the last to be made in this manner. So Peterson defines the Type X as having a pommel but not a upper guard. So it's interesting to see how this later design maintained stylistic facets that visually connect them to the older style of sword design. This next sword is a Peterson Type L. The museum has it labeled as JPO 2252, but in Swords of the Viking Age, it's 2262. I don't know which one is right, but it is obviously the same sword. This sword is 34.7 inches overall in length, with a 30-inch long blade. Also, since the fuller extends almost to the tip of the sword, Pierce speculates that this was a sword that was shortened down in antiquity. And he has this sword dated to the mid-9th to mid-10th century. So Type L is going to be the earliest type of hilt where the guards start curving away from the grip. This is typically regarded as a native English or Anglo-Saxon design, but since more of this style has been found in Scandinavia and Norway rather than England, Pierce believed it worth considering it as a Scandinavian type hilt, meaning that its popularity in Scandinavia led to its predominance in England. Pierce felt confident that this was a river find because of the jet black nature of the blade's surface. So this may be the most likely candidate for a authentic Viking sword that we're looking at in this video. Pierce notes that there are traces of silver inlay on the upper and lower guard as well as the pommel. And there's a large iron ferrule on the guard of the sword. And because of the curvature there, it looks like it would have fit very nicely up against the bottom of the upper guard of the grip. So here we have JP02260, another Peterson Type X, very similar to the pattern welded one that we looked at earlier. It's just a very simple but well-made blade. I kind of imagine this as the quintessential blade as a lot of the swords in the Bayeux tapestry are very reminiscent of this sort of sword. To me, it sort of reflects the reasoning behind why Carolingian swords were so desired by all warriors of Northern Europe. A weapon purpose-built for combat, no frills, no flashy decorations, only utilitarian function for perilous times. The thick guard promises durability and strength. Deep, clean fullers lighten the broad, cutting blade. You can see that the top edge has got quite a bit more wear and tear on it than the bottom. I'd like to think that this is battle damage sustained from some epic battle. Of course, there's no evidence of this, but hey, I can dream, can't I? The point also appears to be broken off as well. Who knows when or how that happened, but I'd like to think that it was in some sort of epic combat or in some desperate last stand on the far marches of the Holy Roman Empire. Here we have another Type X, JP02251, included in Swords of the Viking Age. So, dates to about 950 to 1050 AD. Mr. Pierce gushes over this sword in his book. He describes it as being well balanced. The pommel is made of solid iron, completely unadorned, and in very good condition, with the balance point on the blade being 5.8 inches away from the guard. The length of the grip is 3.7 inches and a massively wide tang. And it's important to note that pretty much all swords of the Viking Age have got these fairly short grips that are 4 inches or shorter. He describes it as being well used, with nicks along both of the cutting edges. Pierce says that there is an iron inlaid inscription on the blade, but unfortunately my camera wasn't able to pick it up. So I wonder if they were able to find this inlay doing x-rays. It has a tapering, slender blade, 29 inches long. Its overall length is 34.5 inches, and the cross guard is 5.8 inches long. So this sword is apparently on loan from the Society of Friends of the Army Museum, catalog number 2013.6.1. This is another Type X. Unlike the other ones we've looked at, this has got quite a bit of decoration on it. You got these geometric patterning on the guard and pommel with some sort of precious metal. This sort of ornamentation was fairly common, actually, exemplified by the fact that 40% of all the Viking Age swords found in Norway had precious metal decoration. The geometric pattern decoration like this predominated until the mid-10th century, when more organic patterns of interwoven tracery began to appear. It looks like the edges, especially this top edge of the sword, look like they've seen combat. On this blade we can see an inscription on the fuller, probably inlaid in iron, although it is fairly illegible and I'm not able to make out all the letters. But you're welcome to take a crack at it if you want. This is JP02255, which I believe to be an Oakshott Type 8. This is a transitional type of hilt that links Viking swords to the knightly swords of the Age of Chivalry. Instead of the D-shaped pommel, the interior corners are curved upwards, which gives your hand a little bit better maneuverability. This is what Oakshott termed a Brazil nut type pommel. The earliest swords like this were found in Norwegian burials dating to about 950 AD, so technically still well within the Viking Age. The blade shape is longer and lighter than the classic Viking sword shape, with more emphasis on a wider fuller. The guards extend quite a bit further, offering better hand protection. This sword is described as being light and handy, weighing in at 3.3 pounds. And I wonder if this lengthening of the crossguard was due to changes in shield design. Obviously, the Viking Age is famous for its round shields, with the central grip protected by a boss. When we get into the mid-11th century, we start seeing kite shields like on the Bayeux tapestry, which were not center grip like Viking shields, but your arm went through two straps. So it made it less mobile, but offered overall more protection for the body, but less protection for the sword hand. So next to it is JP02241. This is another blade featured in Swords of the Viking Age, a direct derivation of the Type X hilt. The long tapering crossguard was dubbed a gadhilt, or spike hilt in Old Norse. And while the pommel is still a Brazil nut type, it's certainly more refined than the previous example we looked at. This is the longest sword in this particular display, coming in just under 40.5 inches overall, with about a 35-inch long blade. The length of the crossguard is 7.7 inches, the length of the grip 3.8, and the point of balance is 8.7 inches away from the guard. Pierce also believed this sword to be a river find. He dates this between the mid-10th and mid-11th century. The museum has this sword dated to 1150 AD. This sword is catalog number J4. While an interesting sword, this is one that I don't personally think qualifies for the Viking Age, but it is included in Pierce's book, so who am I to omit it? Pierce describes this one as being from the late 11th to early 12th century, with an exceptionally wide blade and a well-preserved original grip that is wrapped in silver wire. The circular pommel represents one of the earlier examples of this type, and this sort of wheel pommel would eventually become overwhelmingly predominant in the swords of the later Middle Ages. And it's also interesting to note that circular pommels are depicted quite often on the Bayeux Tapestry, alongside ones that are arguably D-shaped. Well, that about wraps it up for this overview. Hopefully you enjoyed it. So while I am personally drawn to true Viking swords, it was really good for me to delve into these presumably Frankish swords, because from my research, their design influenced those made in Scandinavia as they made their own creative variations and versions of these Carolingian swords. So in my mind, they kind of set the standard of quality and design. It's also interesting for me to look at it as a sort of piece of the puzzle in sword evolution. So if you saw my video on the Valsgard artifacts, the style of the swords featured in that video is a style mirrored in finds from England and the continent, with prime examples of these being the Sutton Hoo sword and the Childeric sword from France. Those swords arguably evolved from the Roman spatha, so the swords in this video show the link from those swords of the 6th century to the long swords and arming swords of the late Middle Ages. So if you're a sword nerd like me, hopefully you learned something. If you're a maker, maybe these will help you the next time you go to make a historically accurate sword. And if you want to see more museum videos like this, let me know in the comments. I do have plans to do more of these in the future. But as always, thank you so much for watching. I appreciate the support. And until next time, be more Viking.